Tonight's speaker, Susan Sellers. From her early career working with Dutch studios Total Design and Una to co-founding a preeminent global design agency to teaching at the Yale School of Art, to her recent appointment at the world's third most attended museum, Susan has kept herself at the epicenter of some of the most exciting design and cultural scenes. Her work has actively explored issues as varied as data visualization, screen-based technologies, critical design, material culture, brand development, and craft. In 1994, Sellers co-founded 2x4, the massive agency in New York, Madrid, and Beijing, creating work for brands such as Vitra, Prada, Nike, Kanye West, and a variety of museums and institutions. On top of that, Susan was appointed the head of design at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she oversees a team of designers, installers, and architects to execute the full range of the institution's design needs. The Met just recently unveiled its new graphic identity, which Susan will speak to tonight. She's also one of the core faculty members of the MFA Graphic Design program at the Yale University School of Art, where she helps shape one of the most prestigious design programs in the world. She has written about design for such publications as Design Issues, and Visible Language, and her work has received countless awards. I'm super excited to have her here, so please join me in welcoming Susan Sellers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Susan. And I'm so pleased and flattered to be here at the Walker. And I want to thank Emmett for inviting me to speak, especially at this particular moment. And also, I want to thank the AIGA Minnesota as well. But the Walker has always been such an ideal model of the way that design could and should operate in a museum as a kind of collaborator and as kind of a shaper of the institutional mission and voice, but also of the content and the experience of the museum. And it's always been a kind of personal model for me. And so, and the fact is, actually, after all this time and thinking and admiring what the Walker has done, I've actually never been here. I've never been to the Walker. I've never been to Minnesota or Minneapolis. And so, it's such a pleasure. I only wish that it wasn't at this particular moment with so much going on so that I could actually spend more time to see something. But I see all of you, and that's great. So I was actually a contemporary of Andrew Blauvelt, and I think we were a very small group of people at a particular moment in time that were thinking about institutional critique in the mid-90s, maybe early 90s, mid-90s, thinking about the role that design takes in shaping culture, in shaping ideas, and that became the very kind of foundation of our design practice at 2x4 and my work kind of generally. So Emmett asked me in particular to kind of draw a line between my work at 2x4 and my work at the Met, and I became head of the Met as the head of design in, I guess, 2013. I've been there about 2.5 years, and I went back to. It's not always easy for me to do, but I went back to this manifesto that we'd written for 2x4, and I still think this is really the foundation of how I think about design and what I've kind of taken to the Met. So this idea of design as being idea dependent, not about media in particular. That you always start with an idea, and that you're very flexible and dexterous about how you communicate and distribute those ideas. And design is about narratives and experiences, but that well-made, well-crafted objects are really important vehicles in communicating and transmitting that narrative. Siri's joining me on my phone here. I want to keep track of the time. I've always done a lot of work with museums and large-scale organizations, and that's always been a really important part of the work of 2x4, that it's not a boutique agency, but a design firm that really aspires to take interesting, let's say marginal or progressive ideas to the forefront of organizations and institutions and make those operational, as we say. And my feeling is really that organizations, that brands are inherently quirky in particular, and they have a kind of character, and that it's really design and designers' role to kind of observe that, to preserve that, and to telegraph that, and that's what makes a particular brand very successful. I also think it's increasingly, and I think it's very visible, I mean, this was written some time ago, that people crave ideas, they crave connection, they crave a kind of depth of experience, and that unpacking that and providing people access to that in diverse and multifaceted ways is really what is kind of the essence of really successful and interesting design. And so the best way to reach people is by being generous with content. And that design is actually not a problem-solving activity. However much we do try to look at research, look at that, it oftentimes unearths a whole new set of conditions, or you could even say problems, but that process, that discursive process and that dialogue is really important. It's the critical kind of operation of design, and it can be used very strategically. And that also, that a studio isn't a kind of fixed entity, but that it's this kind of dynamic hub where lots of different processes, people, products come together in kind of ever-shifting networks. So this to me is still a kind of operative statement of purpose. At 2x4, as I mentioned, we have always worked across cultural and commercial enterprises, and we see that really the idea of culture, the idea of human habits, human interests, what people find interesting, the ideas they're exploring are equally evident across cultural and commercial enterprises. That's the real key to interesting, kind of meaningful design. And so we've always crossed those disciplines. Though I have to say that I have done, and 2x4 has done, an enormous amount of work with museums all over the world at the same time. That practice began very simply in the early 90s in print, in really trying to package content, progressive ideas in print, in magazines, in books, but always thinking about the translation of that content in a kind of dynamic way, that there was a kind of interrelationship between print, film, animation, distribution of ideas, and this kind of mutability, this idea of nimble content was always inherent in 2x4's work. You know, we in the early days made posters. We made marks. This is Lachman's mark that was originated with a collaboration with John Baldessari, who drew this initial mark. And we then translated that graphically. We brought a kind of a font and a system to that. And of course, we've done a lot of work in design systems, dynamic design systems. Of course, that gets extended to screen. Oops. And then I think one of the things that's really characterized that practice is working with walls. What does a wall mean? And one of the things that we've always done is to ask really basic questions and ask, if you think you know what a wall means, maybe you should ask again, and because those categories can always shift in terms of design. So we've done lots of walls that are textured, walls that are flat, walls that are two-dimensional and three-dimensional, walls that are bits and fragments of original things, collages, walls that get replicated in space, walls that extend to the street and become advertising, again, walls that are broken or walls that become signs and identifiers, walls that become dynamic or that suggest filmic environments, walls that get translated back down to pixels, and things that are also cross disciplines between screen and kind of flat surfaces, walls that get dematerialized by animation or filmic translation, animation that becomes architecture, architecture that becomes images. And we've always, again, in this idea of being idea specific and media and not media specific, we've always felt free to explore any type of translation or any kind of, let's say, visual articulation freely and experiment with that, and sometimes accept the roughness or the lack of the amateurism that comes from that. We've always been very interested in film conceptually and in animation. This is an animation that we created for a runway show in Prada in collaboration with AMO and Office for Metropolitan Architecture. And one of the things that has really characterized our work has always been really intense and long-standing collaborations with people working in diverse fields, sometimes in content production, sometimes in architecture or other types of design or media production. So here are walls that literally get eroded by flowers and kind of nature in this environment that also create walls and create space reciprocally. And we've also been always involved and really interested in, sorry, sometimes these work and sometimes they don't. So sorry about this. Interested in technology. That can sometimes not work. Yeah, I'm doing that now. Sorry about this. I'm not sure why it's not. Oh, there it is. So we've always been interested in technology, and this is actually a piece that we created in collaboration with Linked by Air. It was a very, very long time ago. It is the AP wire, basically integrated with motion capture model. So it's for Prada, it's about fashion, and it's about, in a way, making commentary on the new and what the new is, and that the new is sort of played out in the body in fashion. But you know, we're really interested in these kind of experimental processes that then can be retranslated into a physical environment. So something that seems ephemeral and is completely time-based becomes a wall or a physical space or architecture, or can come back and kind of circle back and become print. We have done a lot of exhibition, actually less art exhibition than other types of exhibition. This is an exhibition that we did for Nike that was actually one of their first interventions in mainland China. This was in Beijing in the 798 district to introduce the brand to a mainland Chinese audience. And there's this kind of dynamic wall. And this is a kind of an architecture within the architecture that is bleachers, that is stage, that is a rotating set of exhibitions. That basically tells the history of the design objects and artifacts that limn the innovation around lightness and speed. And we've also always been interested in speaking about design and speaking about the ways that design plays out in many different disciplines and is articulated through many, many different forms, in this case in product design and advertising and experiences, in the physical performance of athletes. And as well, we've always pursued this idea of participation and people getting involved and being a part of the content production of the landscape of an exhibition. Oops. This was taken a bit further with an exhibition that we did for the Cooper Hewitt probably about 5 years ago or maybe 6 years ago. It was before widespread social media. And in this exhibition, which was about the National Design Awards, we created a kind of interface that allowed the visitors to basically interpret and to kind of, in a way, make commentary or to amend the labels in the exhibition so that the visitors were as much the curators and the kind of purveyors of the content and the value of the objects as the curators of the exhibition. And so we've always been interested in the ways that media can upend these kinds of traditional relationships around who owns meaning, who owns the value of certain types of cultural artifacts, and who has the right to comment on those things, which frankly is very resonant now that social media has such a large role to play in the value around things like design and art. In these projects, they over time, these projects have become very large and strategic. We were very involved with the rebranding of Lincoln Center, which was an initiative that we worked on with Diller and Scafidio when they reimagined Lincoln Center. And so simple things like putting a name on something, clarifying entrances, creating a kind of transparency between what happens inside an organization and the city street, creating a kind of a visibility and a sort of, as I said, a kind of generosity of content in an institution, and also even giving the language, giving an institution or helping the institution create a kind of language to speak about their ambitions, to share their vision or the aspirations for the institution within the organization, and then to articulate its outside as increasingly has been the work of 2x4 and really is the function of brand. So these are both examples of how to sort of make an institution, a very monolithic, legendary institution, more transparent, more visible, create more of a kind of dialogue between the architecture, the organization, the programming, and the public. Scale has always very much been a part of the studio's work, and it was never an ambition of the studio to do small work, though it has done very, very diverse types of work, but to think about scale and the way that scale impacts design and design programs, and what the kinds of, what's really at stake and what the potential is of working at the scale. This is CCTV, which is, of course, designed by OMA. And we designed the identity and the wayfinding and the public interface, the experience design for this building, an enormous building of 2 million square feet. And so a lot of our work has been how to really clarify very, very complex organizations and distill those ideas and in a way hold on to the interest and the complexity of that narrative while still making it provide a kind of simplicity in terms of negotiation, and I mean that in a kind of metaphoric way, not just physically, but in terms of the ideas and the potential of the place. And so just to kind of end this short chapter on 2x4, I end with a kind of piece that we did for NYC by Design, which is an initiative to foreground design activities in New York City and talk about the collaboration between design disciplines in the city and the role of New York City in the larger kind of global design community. And this was a kind of what we call the multifesto for design, this kind of open-ended dialogue to question what the role of design was and to kind of create a crowdsourced vision for design in the city in what happened to be 2013. How this worked exactly was that it was a kind of interface that you could access online or by your phone, and you could enter your 3-word manifesto, and then that was collected and kind of shot out across all types of screens and different kinds of communication vehicles in the city. So it basically occupied Times Square for a certain portion of the day, every day for the duration of NYC by Design, which is about a 3-week period. And it also was shot out in terms of public service through, all the taxi cabs and various print vehicles. But I think the message always for us has been that design is a type of thinking through things, and that's a very reciprocal relationship. And so is it the thing, or is it the thinking? Is it the discussion, or is it the object? I mean, that's a kind of symbiotic relationship, and maybe something we talk about later. So this dynamic process and this interest and real focus on process is what brought me to think much more both critically and constructively around the idea of brand and what brand is and what the potential is. And I think in a way, and I'm going to make a supposition and I'm not going to substantiate it at all, is that brand in a way has become the new ideology. If 2x4 grew up in a time around defining and kind of unearthing and revealing ideology, ideology is something that concept is kind of morphed and transformed and really become kind of packaged in the concept of brand. I have a very free and flexible and let's say open image of brand. To me, brand is simply about working with an idea, whatever that idea is, and it's a principle that can apply to any type of content. It's a process and a principle that is actually really helpful in doing that. It's not a slogan or a logo. It's it's strategic, and design is really the tactical end of brand. Brand is something that creates a kind of cohesion. It's between many people working together, and in this case, the structure of a museum. But it also is the way that but design is what basically helps you shape speaking a certain, or telling the idea of a certain story through and for many, many vehicles. So that tension between a core idea and the way it's articulated in many different forms across many different vehicles is really, what design is. And so for me, brand is about strategy. It's the story. It's the essence of the story. And design is really about how you tell it. It's about the storytelling. One of the metaphors I use is the idea of film noir, that when you know film noir, when you watch a film noir film, it usually starts with the person dying. You know they're dead. And the question is, so you know the end of the story, the end is already revealed, but the interest, the idea of suspense, the intrigue is really how you get there, and that's the pleasure that you take in watching that film, and that's the interest and the journey. And in many ways, I think that design functions in a very similar way. Design is always internal and external. The idea of brand organizes initiatives and priorities. It sets the strategy. And design articulates that. First, it's just about articulating that vision, making it clear, presenting an image to work toward, and then helping to realize it in the end. And so this idea, it's a very kind of symbiotic and dynamic process. And I guess I talk specifically about this because I think brand also, however much it's pervasive, however much it is, everyone talks about it and everyone thinks they know what it is, it's still a very kind of evasive or elusive concept. And its real function and how it operates culturally is something I think that's still something up for debate and discussion. So to me, brand it's a value proposition, it's a wish or an aspiration. It's kind of this, what I sometimes call a beautiful idea. And again, design's how you get to that beautiful idea. It's a story, but perhaps most importantly, it's a relationship. It is not something that you can make or construct. It's something that exists, and it's something that you cultivate. And like any relationship, it's subject to all the things that define any relationship. It's based in consistency. It's based in authenticity, being who you are, being true to who you are, and it's based in trust. And those things are a really essential component of what makes an effective brand. And how those things are articulated, of course, is the design. And those things can be articulated in language, and architecture, and amenities, or destinations, or programming, through wayfinding, through mapping, through different types of media, exhibition, display. All of these things are the language or the voice or the thing that articulates and defines that relationship. So that type of thinking really brought me to the Met, and I was very interested to see and be a part of that process from the other side. After doing many, many design programs and initiatives, I was very interested in the idea of being a part of such a legendary organization to think about its future. So what is the Met? I mean, in many respects, this is the image of a Met. It's a very monolithic legendary organization. To some people, it's like kind of the swinging 60s. This is an amazing Gary Winogrand photograph in the Met's collection. It could be seen as elitist or exclusive. And here's the other side of that, more current version, where I may think of that Gary Winogrand photograph, maybe more people think of this. This is a kind of small patch worn away in one of the special exhibition halls. It speaks to the enormous amount of program that the Met, hosts and supports, and it speaks to the layers of history, the legacy, and the influence of that on the organization. But perhaps most of all, most defining about the Met is its enormous, enormous scale. And so it's very interesting for me, and one of the reasons I was so fascinated in being involved in the organization was the fact that I felt so strongly about the idea of this kind of fluidity between commercial enterprises and cultural enterprises, and that kind of the way that different philosophies and work could support and should be thought more cohesively. And the idea of the Met, really, it's all the systems that you create for museums, or that one that I have, they actually are kind of blown out of the water in a place like the Met. They're just not robust enough for an organization of this scale. And so that scale was an enormous challenge and a kind of real point of interest in thinking about and being involved in the institution. So just to elaborate that scale, this is the scale. Here are some numbers affiliated with the Met. There are 2,500 people approximately that work on staff at the Met. There are 46 departments, and there are 17 curatorial departments, almost 150 curators on staff. And in fact, before Tom Campbell, the current director, took his post, the museum was really conceptualized as 17 museums under one roof, and that legacy has really shaped a lot of the institutional operations and a lot of its thinking currently. And the design department is quite robust. It's in fact, 2x4 is a little bit bigger than this right now, but it's not dissimilar in size from 2x4. So 30 staff, 2 teams that we restructured, one that is devoted to print branding and digital, more brand identity, and one that deals more exclusively in exhibition, creative directors, producers, architects, exhibition designers, lighting designers, etc. So a really diverse group of people. So I actually, when I came to the Met, any design program needs to start with an aspiration and a kind of goal. And this was the goal that was set forth by the director. It's a big museum, and it's a big goal. It's a big aspiration. And right off the bat, we analyzed. I joined the Met with 2 other staff members, one the chief digital officer and one a chief marketing officer, and we analyzed what we should go forward. In fact, Tom Campbell, the director, said he felt like the museum obviously has incredible legacy, incredible programming, but there were a lot of legacy systems in the museum that needed to be reconsidered, that could be reconsidered, and that in this moment in time, the museum might be the time to reconsider how the museum could be more unified. And so we looked critically, and as just kind of an opening point, we set forth a kind of general strategy to move forward, that the museum should be more unified. It should be dynamic, but we needed to create a kind of cohesiveness. It should be open, that we wanted to create a sense of community, a sense of open dialogue, a sense of freedom to explore ideas and share them. And with many museums, it's very important to create a sense of ownership, that it isn't an exclusive community of scholars, although that is a very important component of it, but that it is a kind of dialogue between people that work in tremendous expertise and knowledge in their respective people and the general public, and that the interface between that scholarship and the value that community can bring in the dialogue around that is important to cultivate. And then, of course, understanding and operating with the legacy of the museum in mind is important. So how do you build on the iconic stature of the museum, and how do you really evolve the museum, what the museum has been, and kind of evolve that into the future? And that, of course, was about really the process of, in a way, just the logistical process of evolution, not revolution, but also about creating a kind of more contemporary relevance for the museum. The museum was in a really particular moment in its history. It has been linked with the cloisters for many years, but it had agreed in the last, I think it was maybe 6 years ago, to take on the iconic Marcel Breuer building on 75th Street and Madison Avenue, the former home of the Whitney, and to kind of house and program that building for a period of time. And so it was a moment when the museum needed to kind of extend its identity and think about how to encompass that and to rationalize that story. It's a pragmatic thing about how to physically make connections for people, but it's also a conceptual problem. What are the connections? What is the story that brings these buildings and this programming together? Where we started was just really thinking about the architecture and thinking about these really iconic aspects of the museum. What is iconic? Certain types of facades and historic architecture, iconic New York City spaces, which happen to be garden spaces of very diverse types, but that really exploit and are very distinctive to the city of New York. And gallery spaces that were actually not white box spaces or black box spaces, but that were kind of very evocative, transportive types of architecturally specific spaces. And that actually the Breuer Building, while once may have been a more neutral space, is as evocative and kind of historically specific as, for instance, the Greek and Roman galleries in the Met, or, for instance, the cloisters. And then I think one very important aspect of thinking about the Met as a whole and how to create a unified vision was the role of digital in the institution. The Met has 32 million unique visitors to the website, and in fact, the highest growth and the most significant numbers of visitors are Chinese and South American visitors. So the audience for the Met and the experience of visiting the Met has radically changed. And in a way, the website and screen-based experience of the museum is more pervasive, is potentially more impactful than visiting the physical locations. While I have to say that the visitors to the Met proper, there are approximately 6.5 million visitors to the main building a year. So it's incredibly significant. It's the largest tourist attraction in New York City that actually is ticketed. There are 44 million people that come to, for instance, Central Park, but it's one of the most heavily visited tourist destinations in the world. So these are the things that we were thinking about in thinking about how to go forward and unite these institutions, how to think about strategy, and how to communicate that, for instance, through identity. With any kind of reconsideration of an institution, one is obligated to think about the world and culture and what are kind of emerging trends or are issues that needed to be considered. And so without going into these in detail, these are some of the things that we were considering deeply in terms of thinking about the future of the Met and how the experience of the Met needed to adapt and change and grow. So new conceptions of authority, that there was a kind of sense of institutions or the government shaping, being the primary kind of force for new experiences and value and culture. And in fact, that has changed significantly if you think about Google or Apple or all of these kinds of private organizations that are increasingly influential at a scope that actually the government can't really participate in any longer or has a very different relationship to. Of course, new types of learning through technology, people are much more, there are much more opportunities for individual or decentralized learning, again, reflecting back on that idea of new conceptions and experience and relationship of who owns ideas and who circulates those ideas. Of course, the forms of art making and all kinds of cultural expression are radically diversified and democratized, and therefore, by extension, there are incredible new audiences through technology, new audiences because the world and the art market and the kind of even the definitions of culture have expanded so greatly. But there is also consistency in this world that's incredibly saturated and competitive in terms of the visual environment, the cultural environment. We've found an incredible desire on the part of people to connect in very simple and basic ways, and this was something that was very important to our thinking. So in terms of thinking of the identity, it was very important for us, again, under this one Met strategy, to think about how we were representing the museum. And to clarify the identity and the presence of the institution in kind of expanding its program and its visibility and its physical locations. And so for those of you who are involved in identity, it's usually you often reconsider naming, and this is what we did. The Met, in fact, had many, many uses, many ways of referring to itself internally, and so that was something that we needed to consider in clarifying the relationship of these 3 locations. There were 4 locations, including the online location. And we decided to actually pursue this kind of what is called a common name strategy to focus the identity on the most commonly used nickname, let's say, of the institution. The name of the museum is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it will never not be that. That is its formal name, and it appears on every document and every articulation of the museum. But the mark basically refers to this more commonly used name, and it's easily and visually simplified when it's basically modified by these specific location indicators, whether it's Breuer Cloisters or online. And here's a little picture of the way that all played out visually. So as you can see, there were many, many different name treatments. There were many, many versions of the logo, which was a piece of existing art, a kind of, reference to kind of universal forms in the Renaissance. It was a kind of piece of art that was appropriated and used at various different times. In fact, that mark, the M, had been used for many, many years. It was trademarked in 1971, but the Met had never had a graphic identity. It never had guidelines. It never had secondary fonts. It was, interestingly, the Met, very early in its history, in the 20s, there was a secretary at the museum that felt the need to, in some ways, sign or to find a way to mark the intellectual products of the museum. And so this person decided that the museum should use a single font for all of its publications. And it hired, actually, Bruce Rogers, the preeminent early American typographer, to design Century for the museum. And in fact, it did use Century for a period of time in all of its scholarly publications. But I think that was, I can't say exactly how long it was used, not for very long. But in fact, there were many marks, many name treatments, uncountable, and very diverse. As with any identity process, we did an enormous audit to kind of try to track the articulations of the name and the larger visual system, and to try to see any trends or kind of emerging principles. This small snippet of the audit, which is just endless. This is a museum that was incredibly fractured and made many materials. And so one word that we started to use a lot was alignment. And it's something that I think increasingly people use in this environment where we need to speak in an incredibly visually crowded environment with so much messaging through so many channels. And so, we looked for places for alignment. There were small pockets of it, but there's incredible amount of communication and complexity, and that simply was very confusing to the visitor and frankly inefficient and unproductive for the museum. So we were very set on creating a holistic image, and these are just a few of our early strategy documents and questions that we posed to inside the museum and also outside. Our partner in this project was Wolf Olins and their New York office, and there was a strategist and a couple designers that worked on this project with us. And at the time, we do have a very robust and strong design team, and I have a lot of experience in strategy in the museum, so it was a very collaborative process and really needed to be because of the complexity of the institution and the general concern around representing the museum authentically. So our mandate really became to create a kind of experience design platform for the museum, to remove barriers, to connect people to art, and to deepen people's connection, we always say, to the museum, to ideas and art, and to each other. But art for sure was at the center of this experience. We did lots of testing in the museum and outside, different studies. And these were a few of the basic, I think the most essential takeaways of that research. One was that the museum was incredibly hard to navigate, and that was both metaphorically and physically a consistent comment in all of the different research that had been done for years. Again, similar to the identity, there had never been kind of proper and comprehensive mapping or wayfinding done in the museum. It's an incredibly complicated building. It's 21 buildings, 2 million square feet. And so just the physical nature of the building, the kind of daunting nature of the building was an incredible obstacle to visitors. In relationship to that, the experience felt disjointed. It was hard to, certainly the idea of diversity and the multiplicity of the museum is one of its strengths, but to constantly battle a lack of continuity or cohesion is exhausting and confusing, and it was something that we wanted to think about in every experience of the museum. Perhaps the most powerful statistic that came out of testing and surveys and interviews was this idea that 45% of visitors who had been to the Met recently felt it was not a place for them. So for whatever reason, the imposing nature of the institution, the environment, perhaps the way that scholarship was articulated, the way those ideas were communicated, was off-putting or felt exclusory to, and this seemed diametrically opposed to the real aspirations and the potential of the museum. And so this was a real point of departure in terms of rethinking the identity and creating this experience design platform. And then perhaps more institutionally, internally, it seemed like the potential of the museum was very under optimized. And so the museum, in a way, because of its stature, because of the legacy of the incredible assets it had to offer, in a way also had the responsibility to really to optimize those things and to think about how they could be most easily accessible. So this strategy this whole study was really an operation to a mandate to increase the relevance, the reach and the relevance of the museum. And so in thinking about the strategy of the museum, we were very inspired by a TED Talk that Tom Campbell, the director, had given very early in his career, which articulated this idea. He was a textile historian that ran the conservation lab, the textile conservation lab in the museum prior to his appointment as director. And he said that one of the big transformations or sort of sea changes in his own trajectory as a scholar was that every art was contemporary in its time, and that his goal was to really make the vivid nature of that time powerful and palpable to audiences. And of course, textiles are a form of a kind of newspaper or a kind of propaganda or a kind of storytelling tool. And so it was very particular to textile, but that became a real touchstone for us in the identity and the strategy and the identity of the Met, was to think about the museum as 5,000 years of contemporary art. How do we really reposition 5,000 years of art and tell the stories that relate to people in their own lives and make that meaning and that visual experience much more kind of close and palpable and useful? So this really led us to an overall experience strategy, which again started with this idea of bringing life to art and reaching more people with that art and that kind of responsibility to do that, to make the museum more unified, more open, and to build on the iconic legacy of the museum. And ultimately to led us to a series of strategies, and everything that we did and that we do in the museum answers to and tries to operationalize these strategies. One is to make connections in the museum, to help people make connections between the past and the present, between genres of art, between time periods, between geographies. Another is to perforate the walls, to create much more fluidity and transparency in the institution, to make people feel comfortable to enter, and also to allow the institution to really benefit from everything that's going on outside the world and not be so insular or exclusive. Another was to create distinctive destinations, to create reasons for people to come and to use the museum and make them feel comfortable to do so, to democratize distribution, so to really to get the assets and to make those available as possible. One great example of is that in the last few years, the Met has taken all of its scholarly publications and published them online, and they're accessible for free everywhere to everyone at any time. And then ultimately to convert visitors in the museum to users. So this is a little bit of a mandate that is a little bit methodological, that we want to think of the museum as a kind of user experience as opposed to, but we also want people to feel ownership in the institution and to feel a part of it in its making and the way it operates, instead of just simply like allow them to come and stay for a while. We want them to really feel like this is their place and that we're responsive to what they need, what they want, and that they're really a part of what the museum is ultimately. So at this, I thought I'd take you through and give you a kind of broad sense of how these mandates play out in the actual work that we're doing in the museum now, and the kind of projects that I've been busy with there. Presenting the Met logo. So this is the way that the Met, the new Met logo, appeared in the press. It was revealed and tweeted about by an architectural critic at New York Magazine. And he apparently had, I don't know, scanned it or taken a photograph of it from some sort of print material. It then circulated and became the kind of subject of a New York Times article. It kind of course, went like wildfire through social media. And there was lots of commentary about it, all, of course, 140 characters or less. And there was a fairly, let's say, objective article on the New York Times to talk about the phenomena of the mark, which juxtaposed the prior image of the Met, the facade, and the mark in relationship to this new image that was released, again, the second visual incidence appearance of the mark, which happened to be at a press preview in late February, maybe mid-February, for the new Costume Institute exhibition, Manus Ex Machina, that will open in May. So there's Tom with his new logo. And the New York Times article, which, for instance, Justin Davidson mentioned, I think he used the metaphor of a bus that was caught in traffic or something as the sort of visual metaphor for the mark. And the New York Times, in a more moderate moment, said the letters leaned together, evoking a tapering walls of the Temple of Dender. The conversation continued and perhaps got a bit hysterical. This was from Michael Kimmelman, the architecture critic at the New York Times. And I have to say that for me, being at the Met and doing this project has been very designerly, shall we say. Like, I've always done work that's very experimental, and I'm in a way, the product of the work at 2x4 and my interest in BIN has almost like design as Rorschach, like putting things out in the world and testing people in terms of what their interpretations are and what they're willing to think and believe and participate in and what they like. So I have to say, when I saw this, I thought, now this is getting interesting. I like this. And, you know, I mean, we live in a postmodern world where, for instance, the reader is perhaps more influential in the meaning of the text than the writer, or perhaps the object of consideration is a mirror of the reader. And so that was interesting to me in considering this comment. But the fact is that concurrently, when the day that this was exposed, Kanye West released Life of Pablo, which was, you know, a phenomenon in New York City and probably elsewhere, I think. And, you know, the album wasn't done, the songs weren't done. And I thought, this is what I would say about the Met identity and the mark. I mean, the mark is not the issue. It's not about a mark. It's about a process. Design is a process. And And I don't think I'm the only one that thinks that. And I also was, while I was very interested and intrigued about the whole process, I was also a bit concerned, I have to say, and taken aback. On the same day, Facebook released a series of expanded emoticons. And I thought it's interesting and perhaps slightly disturbing that our public debate is so circumscribed by 2 or 6 or 7 emoticons, and that we should really think hard about what we want our public debate to be around cultural artifacts and the expression of our collective public organizations. So that's a little story about how that all unfolded, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. But the fact is that this identity was on the street in August of this year. So that happened in mid-February. And the fact is that we took possession of the Breuer building, the iconic Whitney building on 75th and Madison, in August of 2015. And we introduced and effectively soft launched the identity at that time on the facade of that building with effectively no response. So I thought I'd actually elaborate what the actual program of the design is, and talk a little bit more specifically about design. So as I mentioned, we started with this common name approach, and the idea was to specify the different locations or institutions under the banner of the Met. We needed to very strongly tie together the physical institutions, and we did it, very, very simply and physically. The mark is a kind of hybrid of sans serif and serif forms. It was designed to be calligraphic, to kind of limn different types of alphabets from obviously Roman to Cyrillic, to create a kind. It was considered a type of a signature, never meant to be perfect per se. In fact, to be idiosyncratic, because in fact, any logo should be distinctive and particular and handmade. And this font was, or this mark was conceptualized by Wolf Olins and by our Met team, and it was actually drawn by Gareth Haig, who's a font designer in London, and also Peter Billick as well participated in thinking about the actual forms of this mark. We were, really the origin of the concept was to think about it as a kind of hybrid classical and contemporary typography, but hearkening back to ligatures. And this is, of course, a metaphor of connections, this idea of making connections, so quite literal, actually. And we looked to many different examples in the Met collection, and we were really interested in kind of classical typography, but we were also interested in the kind of 70s editorial design of Pushpin and Herb Lubalin, and some of that period typography that was very graphic, but that also was marrying kind of historical and contemporary forms. The identity is obviously the mark, and the mark is conceptualized as quite kind of simple and solid and unchanging, because the program of the Met is so dynamic that we wanted to have that kind of stable, kind of consistent presence to kind of juxtapose and compare and contrast with all of the programming that happens at the Met. There are 2 fonts that were redrawn for the Met for custom use. They were based in existing fonts. One is the Met Sans is a redrawing of Caliber, which is from Kiln Foundry, and the Met Serif is essentially Austin, designed by Commercial Type. And then with that, again, in a way extending the metaphor of reinterpreting the classical forms of the letter forms, we created a distinctive set of ornaments that were designed to the weights of the 2 different fonts, and would become a kind of tool that could be used in pattern or could connect diverse types of content, and would just be another element that could be used over time. The palette, we chose this, we felt very strongly that we needed to have a single brand color to unify, because the voice of the museum is so eclectic. We felt we needed a color to unify the major institutional communications, but that all the exhibition, and it's important to know that the Met has 60 large-scale exhibitions and really 70 to 90 exhibitions of varying scale a year, more than any museum in the world. And 60 of those have individual identities and are packaged in diverse ways. So while basic museum communications oftentimes use this expanded red palette, many, many things operate with the kind of expanded spectrum of color. But we chose red because we liked it, but also it actually is one of the first pigments. It is the second pigment if you consider black a color, but it is the first pigment that was originally created from cochineal beetle shells. It is omnipresent throughout the collection. It's a color that signifies passion and kind of vitality and specialness. And it also was a kind of palette that could link together. One of the things at the Met is that almost all the communications, or we aspire all the communications, to be articulated in 12 different languages. And so we wanted to tie those things together and create a kind of billboard for that in order to create a kind of a very concrete, visual, accessible interface with international audiences. And as I said, the audiences have shifted incredibly at the Met, and the attendance on the part of Chinese, Asian visitors, and South American visitors has exploded. So this is something that's an incredible tool to visitors. And this palette directly links back to carmine and to the kind of cochineal color. Here are the fonts, and the way that some of the ornaments play out. I have to say that this is really also very important to say. I meant to mention at the beginning of it is that this is a real report from the front, because this identity program really was launched officially on March 1st and was coordinated with the opening of the Met Breuer, which actually was only open to the public on March 18th. So you'll notice that their photographs and illustrations, none of this material has even been really properly documented. It's really a first look and a way that the program plays out across diverse types of vehicles. So it's connected, for sure. It's visually connected, but it's also quite diverse. And there are these two tiers of identity, one, the Met identity, and then very diverse programming that has its own set of visual identity. Of course, one of the critical mandates was to link all the print, environmental, and digital communication. And just some other kind of quick images to give you a picture of the way that communication has changed from that early picture that I gave of the diverse ways that the institution had represented itself and its programming. And so all this to say that the first exhibition at Breuer is called Unfinished, and I think that it's a really apt metaphor for any identity when it's launched, is that it is essentially unfinished. It's about a process, it's a type of communication, it's a language. The logo being one small part of that. And one of the really critical parts of this that I think is quite different for a place like the Met as a museum is that the partners that participate in communication at the Met is so much more diverse and robust inside the organization and outside. So there really did need to be tools for everyone to work together to create this alignment. And that was certainly a big part of the reconsideration. So that's a little bit about the identity, but I wanted to frame that that was a very important platform for the experience design Met, protocols for the Met, was really to think about what is the real baseline of what we need to create connection and create point of access for audiences. And at the very least, we needed a consistent language and a reliable language to speak to our audiences. But of course, also a very, very important mandate was how to think about exhibition. So I wanted to take you through a single exhibition in terms of the way we're rethinking exhibition design, which is also under the mandate of the design department. So this is an exhibition for the Costume Institute. It was 2 years ago. It was one of the first projects I did at the Met. I worked with Diller and Scafidio, with Liz Stiller, as architects, on this project. It was the exhibition that was kind of the theme of the Met Ball at that year, and it was about Charles James, who is not so familiar. He was a kind of cult couturier from the mid-century, who was a kind of tailor and a kind of philosopher around fashion, who really constructed a lot of basic ideas that, for instance, Christian Dior with the New Look and Balenciaga and many others attributed the whole kind of, in a way, the kinds of foundational tenets of American fashion in the middle of the last century. So Charles James always said he was an architect. He was an architect of fashion. And so we took that really literally, and we were interested in applying architecture as a discipline and as a metaphor to fashion. And one of the things about this show that I think is so important in terms of thinking about exhibition and about translating the story, the narratives and the culture of the museum to the public is this idea of familiarity and lack of familiarity. And I think that with a lot of the art objects at the Met, this is very common, which is that these are objects that are too familiar, and so we don't look at them carefully. In a way, this was a collection that came from the Brooklyn Museum of almost 600 documents and gowns and toiles, which are the kinds of prototype or muslin dresses. It was a collection that was brought into the Met. So there are things that were, kind of faded images of a certain type of glamour. And I think that what was important about these things was very hard for people to access because they were just almost too familiar. It looked a little bit like 1950s prom gowns in a way. What are these things? And then also not familiar enough. So the audiences of the Met weren't well-versed enough in, for instance, seaming or construction or some of the more specific aspects of fashion to sort of unpack why Charles James or this work was so influential in its time. So that's something that kind of interface or idea is something that I use a lot at the Met in thinking about how to provide more narrative and create more points of access for people to understand the artifacts and the kind of narratives around them. This is a Cecil Beaton photograph of Charles James gowns in the 40s. And so the exhibition, we sort of arranged, as I said, we used this kind of contemporary architecture as a kind of interface to think about the relationship of this historic fashion, these historic objects. And so we arranged these dresses in a grid, a very modernist grid. And the idea is that when you walked in this space, these are the renderings from the initial concept design, that you really experienced the glamour of the objects in and of themselves, unadulterated, that you could just experience what they are as objects, uninterpreted, but enhanced with lighting and made beautiful and conserved, and there was an enormous amount of conservation to do. But that when you walked past, that you would be given much more specific information about the things that you really can't see easily in these objects, the construction, the choices around the historical forms inherent in the gown, the choices that Charles James made that became so iconic around thinking about fashion as a discipline. And so this kind of tension between understanding something intuitively and then having something unpacked is something that is, I think, a really important, it's something that I personally, a kind of design ideology I hold really close, but also I think something that has incredible power in an environment like the Met, to give people the opportunity to experience something for what it is, and to interpret it on their own, and then to unpack that by something that is, yes, didactic, but also sort of beautiful and inspired. So this is, sorry for the slight bit mapping, the actual exhibition, and then this kind of move where you walk past and you see these screens. And these kind of handles are robot arms that go and track certain aspects of the dress and focus your attention on them. So they'll look at the way a waist is constructed, or it will follow a seam, or actually will a robot arm will sort of go under the dress. And one of the things Charles James did was embed all of these colors and details into parts of the dress you didn't see in toiles inside the dress. The robot arms would sometimes go in and visualize that for you. So you can see a bit of how that works. And then these screens basically unpacked the construction of the dresses by applying kind of architectural rendering techniques to the dresses themselves. So you could see, really physically see the volume, the construction. And so for me, this idea of making connections, this exhibition has been really important for me in thinking about how to unpack complicated content for people and provide a very visceral sort of personal experience with an object, and then also unpack difficult content or content that isn't easy to access with the naked eye, and to do so in a way that is visual and accessible and available to a very diverse audience. So this is explicitly showing the construction of the way that certain types of fabrics connect. But sometimes these might talk about the way that a particular aspect of a dress might relate to a previous kind of historical example. These kind of unpack and become patterns and show the way each thing's layered. And this material also becomes this incredible archive and information source on these objects, which have never really been documented with such detail. So there's really, while it's kind of beautiful and interesting and entertaining, it also contains an enormous amount of scholarly information that hasn't been unpacked. One of the things that we are increasingly trying to do is to show things in process or things are being made, and these are one of the amazing assets that came with this collection were 40 toiles, original kind of prototypes of Charles James dresses. And another section of the exhibition tried to amplify details and really, again, follow seams and details, but augment vision and kind of amplify critical and details in the construction of different iconic dresses. And this room is a small archive of Charles James' process, of a lot of memos and things that he wrote in his studio to his assistants, to experimental projects, prototypes. Actually, he was hypothetically, the inventor of the first down jacket. And there it is, people. It's very notorious. It's been worn by all of these different people, from like Jerry Hall to, I don't know, to people. Perforate the walls. I mean, one of the other things we've been doing is thinking about the ways that we can simply open up what's happening in the museum. A year ago, we reinstalled a Solowit piece from the 60s in one of the kind of open sort of corridors between departments in the museum. And so rather than always inventing exhibitions, we are thinking about how we can simply open up aspects of the museum and make them available to the public. So ordinarily this would be cordoned off and you wouldn't be able to see this process, and you wouldn't be able to understand, what this piece is, that it is kind of physically repainted, why. And so this was something that we opened up within the museum and made into and advertised as an exhibition, but also made available to the public. Not so much in this sped-up version, but in a whole series of blog posts and short film pieces around the installation, the piece. So we've been really thinking about how to just optimize what the museum does all the time and make it available to the public. This idea of creating distinctive destinations. One, of course, destination that we've been working very hard on, and there's lots of ways to think about this concept, is the Met Breuer. So I thought I'd very quickly show a bit. I think that this was a really important correlative of the identity of launching the new brand and kind of setting forth the new vision. So this building is a building that is basically an 8-year lease for the Met with a kind of rider to renew for another 8 years. We're stewards of this building, we're tenants, and there are a lot of restrictions in terms of the changes we can make in the building, but we did want to think very hard about how to occupy this building, how to live in it, and how to do justice to the architecture. And this is an architectural photograph by Ezra Stoller, who documented the building upon its opening in 1966. And we were very interested in going back to Breuer's original intentions, his drawings, the original advertising and promotion around the building, and thinking about how we could restore the building and bring it back to Breuer's original vision, and how we might evolve that vision, and really stay true to Breuer's vision that this museum should house art, should make art should come first, and that it would change and grow. And the fact is actually that the museum, within its very, very early days, it was acknowledged on the part of many that it was inadequately designed for the crowds that ultimately, and actually almost from its very inception, would come through the doors. So our mandate was to rethink about this. I'm going to go back to this. To think about this building as an object in the collection, to take it on as that, to be stored, to declutter it, to kind of pull away the generations and the decades of reinterpretation and use and just clutter, to put art first, and to rethink some of the really operative qualities of the museum that Breuer also saw as being kind of let's say, open to interpretation in its time. Here's the banners. The building is incredibly iconic. It's, dark granite on the outside. It's concrete on the inside. It's, a 1960s brutalist building. You'll see our little red carpet. One of our reinterpretations in thinking about the iconic museum was to kind of reinterpret that for the opening of the museum by painting the cantilever red and sort of marking. Of course, actually, I'm sorry, I didn't say one of the really important aspects of re-inhabiting this building was also thinking about the Met presence. That how do we redefine this museum in the minds of this public? Not so much to obliterate the Whitney, but to just establish this now the Met programming is happening here. We wanted to be very careful and specific about how what we chose to do, and given the terms of our agreement with the Whitney and the time that we would occupy the building, we needed to be very deliberate in those choices. That's our little inverted red carpet, kind of hearkening back to the main building in the opening, which is, can I just say, temporary. It is not permanent. So the building, we took a somewhat preservationist approach to the building, and we worked with Beyer Blinder Bell on that in the building. They served as executive architects and as and oversaw the preservation, the very light-handed preservation of the building. The building is concrete, different types of concrete, polished and aggregate, and we simply cleaned the concrete, and the building was always meant to sort of be a kind of rough surface that would be reinterpreted, and frankly, art would be placed and holes would be made, but it had really all kinds of loose anchors and things had kind of built up over time, and so we went through and very carefully took out those things. Oftentimes left those holes open, but other times did fill them if they were incredibly destructive. But it was incredibly gentle process. Other materials that were really iconic in that space are blackened bronze or patinated bronze, and this kind of warm, rich teak. And so we went and we actually took off all of the kind of resin and shellac and the kind of generations of buffing and polishing and sealing the wood, and restored it just to its natural wood, and just waxed that. And We did, in places where there were a lot of use in the black and bronze, we actually repatinated the bronze, but in some places where it was really natural, we were very careful about respecting the patina of the building. So you'll see that at the top of that railing, it's worn off and it's brass, or it's yellow. And so those things we retained. Another important material in the building is black granite, which is, of course, the facade and the book bar, the iconic book bar. So we just cleaned that and restored it to its original use. And we extricated the retail. We took away all of the kind of shelving and detritus. There were sheetrock walls and things that we had been built over the years to disguise certain things. We took that all away. We took all the kinds of desks and interfaces, like kind of public visitor service interfaces, and we redesigned those and clarified and opened the space. And then we, very importantly, one of the most iconic gestures of the space is the lighting. We actually restored all of the shades and actually worked with the original manufacturer of the bulbs to create new LED bulbs that would be all aligned in terms of the temperature and create like an incredible consistency. And we also integrated all new code requirements and things into the ceiling. So it really just made an enormous, enormous difference in the building and sort of making it kind of clear and clean and revitalized. Above the book bar was an enormous kind of slate grid that was designed by Breuer as a kind of information wall that could change and communicate information or sell product. And so we actually decided that we would make that more contemporary, and this would be one of the places where we would create this insertion of Met identity. And we created this kind of large-scale media wall that dynamically tells all the program that happens across the three institutions, but also becomes a kind of screen that can be customized for particular events, or can become a kind of public gallery or a space for commissioning new digital work, and that can enliven and make that space a kind of very vibrant public space that connects the art and connects the institution with the street. And there you see the book bar. And then another insertion that we made very, very simply was to try to rethink the sunken garden, which had had a whole different series of purposes during the Whitney's time in this building, and it always felt a bit dank and sort of never quite resolved. And so we decided that in order to link it to the two other buildings, the main building and the cloisters, one of the major and most beloved features of those buildings are the gardens. And so we decided to do a landscape commission, which we did with Gunter Valkt. And so this is a series of quaking aspens that are very naturalistically painted. And there's a kind of amazing carpet of lowbush blueberry under them. And this also could be a kind of, just a very kind of free and public space, and that can be used for performance, but will ultimately be housed by a kind of restaurant as well. The two exhibitions that this building is used almost exclusively for changing program for temporary exhibitions for the modern and contemporary department. And one of the exhibitions is an incredible exhibition on the unfinished in painting, from Renaissance painting to contemporary art. And in terms of design, we, in keeping with this idea of respecting the building, seeing the building as an object or as an art object in and of itself, we went back to Breuer's original drawings and his intention for the ceiling and created a kind of exhibition design program, a wall system that links directly into the grid of the ceiling and stands with feet kind of raised on the floor, so that it also never comes to the walls. It's never built into the walls. So they're always kind of objects in the space of the building, as opposed to becoming architecture and confusing the exhibition architecture with the architecture of the building itself. So this is unfinished, just in its... And the other exhibition is an exhibition of an Indian artist and architect named Nazreen Mohammadi. And the purview of the Met Breuer is really to think about global modernism, so extending the kind of time frame and the geographic influence of modernism, and bringing artists that have not had the kind of the weight of the Met brought to bear on their work, or the visibility, and as well shows that are very distinctive to the Met, and that the Met can draw out the kind of the purview or the time frame, or bring different perspectives to bear based on their own collection to contemporary work. But in terms of design, you see a bit about the way the wall system works in relationship to the building. What's that again? Democratized distribution. So as I said, these 60 exhibitions in many of the programs take on identity of their own and sit sort of above as a kind of secondary identity under the Met identity. And this is an initiative that was started by the new director of education called Take the Met. And the idea, again, was to really open the museum to diverse audiences, in this case kids, but also diverse institutions. So to use the incredible influence, the space, and the audiences of the Met to create a kind of, to create almost a kind of huge maker lab all over the space of the museum, and to allow institutions all over the city, in this case 40 institutions, to occupy the museum and to kind of promote their own agendas and their own work under the umbrella of the Met, and to have that kind of visibility and attendance. So this is just a little visual identity that essentially created all these different assets and made them available to all of these different partners to use for their own promotion. There are things that individual organizations could customize for themselves and to kind of juxtapose their own identity and their own authority with the Met. Or, for instance, visitors could also customize. Just super simple. Again, something that preceded the identity, and of course something that works across platform, and again, it can be really easily mobilized by diverse partners. And then the final tenet of this experience design was the idea of converting visitors to user, to creating a culture of ownership. And this is a very sort of basic and functional project, but as I mentioned earlier in the research, wayfinding and navigation and orientation is one of the major barriers to the perception of the Met as being open and relevant and easy to access. And so one of the things that we've pursued is a kind of new mapping system for the museum. And this basically focuses on one of the things that the Met hasn't had, which I think is really common in an institution that's very large and complex, is a sense of what we call like a mental map, like a mental conception of what this space is. And so we wanted to create a kind of priority route system which is this red line, the red route, that basically outlines the kind of basic architectural orientation of the building for people, which is quite complex in the site. Simplify these areas and destinations and create a kind of overall vision of the museum that's calming, because the actual physical experience of it is not always so calming. And the idea of this was also to create a kind of scalable system, so to make this a dynamic system that is scalable and can change over time, that's basically run through a single content management system, and is about placing the museum in the city, placing you in the space of the museum, but also can eventually be adapted to really enhance the experience of the collection and engage the content in the museum and create a more kind of customized experience. One of the agendas is, again, to extend the kind of navigation of the museum and the narration of it to diverse languages, and to make that incredibly facile for the visitor. Curated experiences, so ways to engage people in the collection in new and different ways, to engage conversations and engage people's ideas and their voices in the actual content and experience. And also to collect data so that actually we can help facilitate people's journeys or their access and their entry and their routes from wherever they are to the museum and out again, but also to think about how we might collect data and better understand the space so that we can mitigate certain issues even in tangible ways in house. So to think about congestion tracking. And while this may seem like something that the MTA is thinking about and this is actually something that is incredibly relevant to a museum like the Met, because as New York City audiences increase, as those visitors increase, the numbers at the Met increase. And so increasingly, we need to, in order to make the experience amenable and to make actually to create an art experience at all, we need to actually think creatively and perhaps with more information about how to organize the space. And so this, while not active currently, is a potentially incredible tool to do that. So that gives you a big picture of this agenda. And so I think I far exceeded the 140 character explanation of the Met's identity and why it's important for an institution to kind of grow and change. But I wanted to return back to this manifesto and kind of re-articulate it as a multifesto, this original 2x4 manifesto that actually I think speaks really well to thinking about museums and the role that design can play in them. For me personally, this experience has been about just forgetting everything I know and starting over, and it's been incredible learning experience. But I also want to thank our many, many partners in all of these projects, and also the incredible team at the Met, not just the design department, but the digital media department, the marketing department, and the leadership there in forwarding all of this work and thinking kind of creatively and open-minded with an institution that has so much at stake and being open to sort of rethinking it. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you so much for that very interesting and enlightening reveal of the new Met system. My question is, in New York, when you say the Met, it can mean either the museum or the opera. Did you think at all whether the new mark, as opposed to the old mark, which definitely says museums, could cause confusion?
We did actually. We thought a lot about that. And again, we were always looking at the holistic system and also the legacy of the museum and the use of the terms. The fact is that the Met Opera actually not so long ago rebranded as the Met Opera and refers to itself as the Met Opera. So all of their communication uses that terminology. And the fact is, though, that just colloquially, both the opera and the Met Opera, the Met Museum have used the moniker the Met, with some sort of kind of tacit agreement. I mean, there's never been any friction, and there may be sometimes confusion on the part of visitors, but it always usually works out with a New York City taxi driver. I'm going to the art museum, not the opera. But it was something that, we looked at and we considered and we had a lot of conversation about. And the fact is that the Met actually trademarked the Met before the Met Opera that exists. But it really was that we'd kind of happily coexisted with a shared name. I mean, there's also the Mets. And that's actually a much more contentious issue, even though there's no relationship. But it's come up a lot in conversation in this type of forum, but it's actually not come up with the opera, and it's not really about, it's not the way that they refer to themselves, and it's not it doesn't bear really any visual correspondence either.
Hello. This
Hi,
isn't.
thank you, Susan. I'm curious because you mentioned about how much design is a process, and my role in life has been overseeing a lot of this process. How did you interface with the stakeholders? Who would be people like donors and board of directors? You talked about blocks and barriers and having worked deep inside organizations. And I don't have to have you limit yourself to that, but how did you involve them in your participatory work?
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. I mean, I couldn't possibly address everything in that process, but it's a good question to ask. And it was one of the things that I was really interested in actually working inside an organization rather than being an external consultant. We in many ways, it was similar to any project that I've done, which is, you do kind of cultural, kind of external, scholarly, and kind of trend analysis. You do interviews inside the organization. You do them outside the organization with influencers or with, potential audiences, and you do visitor journeys and track that. But we did have a really robust network of collaborators in the museum. The team that we used to guide the process, we had actually a very, very small leadership team, which that directed the process, the project, and made the decisions. So Cynthia Round, who's the head of external affairs and marketing, was my partner in the project, and we were the working team, the two of us, with Wolf Olins. And then the leadership team was the director, the president of the museum, the strategic consultant, the kind of advisor to the director, Cynthia, and myself. So that was the leadership team that basically vetted the whole process, made all the decisions, and forwarded that. And then there was an advisory council of curators and, let's say, department heads in all the representative departments in the museum, probably about 50 people. And so we would make decisions, and we would bring it to this group, and we would have discussions. We had presentations. We had a set of workshops, and so we brought them along in the way, and also, kind of had important discussions, collected important information, and brought that back to the process. With trustees, we had an external affairs committee, and so we would bring each stage of the project to the external affairs committee, again, take commentary and concerns. So a lot of things like, for instance, the name of the museum in relationship to the Met Opera. I mean, these were things that were subjects of many layers of conversation with many, many constituents. And then outside of the trustees, we actually would take each phase of the project to the broad staff, which the staff of the Met is 2,500 people. So we would actually have day-long presentations where we would make the same presentation throughout the day at different times, starting usually at 7 or 8 in the morning, because certain staff is only there early, so that everyone could participate in the process. And some of it was more informative, keeping them up to date on where we were in the process. We did a series of more workshop type projects, even with the broad constituents of all the people in the museum. We did some surveys where we asked questions, we tracked information, and we looked closely at that, and then we represented it to the staff, and we would have like town halls around around the findings in those presentations. So it was quite robust, shall we say. But I have to say that having been involved in a lot of projects like this, it was not intrusive, and it was quite constructive. And I think that what was very important was having a working team, having a very clear and small leadership team, and also being so transparent within the organization. So I think it actually worked quite well. Of course, now is the challenge when you really when you start to do it. A lot of the people are fine with it, but then when it starts getting going, then more questions come up. It's like 3 days in, so.
So I'm curious, both from your standpoint as the designers of it, the new identity, but also, so that's what sort of one side, but then the board and your boss, what are the measures of success going to be for this new system?
Well, it's really, really interesting point. I think a connected experience. I think ultimately, not attendance and numbers in programming. It's not so visible in this, but I think that attendance and tracking how people move through the museum will be very influential. And we will go back and rethink certain things. And for instance, the idea of putting a map in place that was very robust and responsive and is scalable and can change over time was really important for that. So numbers and tracking in terms of audience and attendance to exhibitions and programming will be important. A lot of it was qualitative, for sure, and that, of course, is less simple to track and to quantify. I mean, you can't, but we'll be there. There's a lot of ongoing research at the museum all the time. There's a fleet of people always doing research, and I have to say that there has not been any research yet. I mean, the response within the museum actually has been fairly positive outside of, the conversation that ensued via social media. And I think that is because you see it in a much larger context and you can understand the difference is quite stark and simple, just in terms of being able to access information in the museum and being able to, even without a full wayfinding program being installed in the museum, it's still much more clear.
Can I ask just one more quick question related to that? So in terms of, there's sort of a piece of ownership of the identity, and then there's, is everybody required to use the new system? How do you get
Yes.
that actually to happen?
Yes, everyone is required. You can't have your own design system. But I have to say that's where the Met is slightly different than other institutions because it actually has a large design firm within it that actually, and most constituents in the museum are actually dependent on that entity to produce a number of materials. And one of the things that I did when I came was to establish a kind of protocol for creative direction for everything, which is, oversight. And so there are lots of different partners, but now those partners are all my good friends. And but actually, I have to say that so far that's actually been going quite well because I think oftentimes the person in a position like this isn't someone who is a designer and who really understands that process. And I tend to be pretty open about creativity and expression, and I'm like game for any idea. Although I can be a stickler about certain things, and of course that's my job in this instance. But so far I have to say that there was I think there was a certain craving for kinds of guardrails or certain, goals and guidelines on the part of external partners. And so far it's been relatively simple. And yeah, certain people, there's small things like people they want to use gray type for their names on their business cards or, and we're still figuring out how much we care about those things, like how important they are to the bigger aspirations. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I want to ask the couple questions. The first question is appreciated that you show the process of the design as the Met Museum. So I'm curious, how long you take you guys, the group, take a research. The time is longer than the kind of produce longer, or which
I can
part
give
is-
you a timetable. So I've been at the museum for approximately 2.5 years, and we started we began the project of actually presenting and appropriating the funds and the support to do the project when I entered. So we spent, I would say, approximately 1 year on the research and on the design of the basic program. And we spent, I would say, maybe somewhere between, let's see, maybe 7, 8 months or 9 months on the implementation. And, we aimed to basically have the program designed so that we could basically forward the opening of the Breuer building and the identity at the same time and have them be parallel. And we used the Met Breuer as a kind of an incubator for lots of initiatives that we wanted to forward in the larger building, but it's much smaller and it was much kind of, and it's obviously new. So it was a way for us to experiment with certain initiatives that we wanted to forward there in a way that was much simpler and less complex, and we could kind of set forth a model and figure that out there. So that was the kind of timing. I would say, maybe our research, maybe was about 6 months, our process of research and discovery and the development of the strategy. The design was a bit less. I have to say it was quite fast in the context of the Met. And the strategy, I would say, was somewhat protracted because there was so much public engagement. And
I know the whole process is all important, the research part and produce work part. But personally, which part do you think is more important, is research or like maybe I know it's kind of equal.
It's very difficult to be successful with design if you don't have a strategy. Like if you don't know where you're going, like what is the measure of success? Like what are you judging it against? I think that you can operate with a much higher level of intuition in a smaller entity, but with an organization that's so large, with such a kind of diverse agendas, you really do need strategy to. And then also, what are you judging design on? Like, is it about the way it looks or is it about the way it performs? So the design might look great, but how is it performing? And you can't really judge that if you don't have a strategy. So, I mean, they're equally important, but I think it's, with an organization of this scale, it's very difficult to be successful if you don't have a strategy. And,
one more quick question. As a MFA student in MCAT, which is I'm really curious, what is Yale's teaching system, and what is make their different?
What makes Yale different?
I'm just curious because we're MFA student graphic design here.
Well, no, that's interesting. I mean, it's not really my charge to determine the strategy at Yale. But I have been there for some time, and it has a very particular legacy, that program. It has a lot of strength. I think its strength is in promoting a kind of generalism, a general approach, and also it has an incredible strength in typography and a kind of history and legacy there. And I think Yale, not just in the design department, but across the institution, is really about, this might sound somewhat arrogant, but I don't mean it like this. It's really about kind of creating unique thinkers, like leaders. So it's not about training, giving people skills or training them to enter and even impact or influence the field. I feel that it's much more about cultivating individual perspectives and creating kind of unique outliers, actually. So I think it's really interesting. I have to say it's a situation where being inside the organization, it's not always clear to me personally what the effect of that is. But that's how I perceive the culture of the place, the students, and how they go out into the world and operate. I think that they tend to be people that are really have very unique visions and are very independent and true to their vision of what design should be and how it should operate in the world. Emmett, do you have any perspective on that? being someone who you know you're going to pass on them. That's how I see it. And interesting because I also, you know, I've taught there for many years and I've been a big part of the community and over the years in lots of different ways. But I also hire a lot of Yale students over the years, both at 2x4 and at the Met. And it's interesting to see what the similarities and differences are to people in different programs. But I have to say that I am not like a full-time educator and I don't take responsibility. I wouldn't really, it's not a big part of my practice. And I'm really someone that advises and kind of supports individual students in thesis and in their graduate work. I don't see myself as a teacher per se. So I don't really think I'm the best person to speak to like a pedagogy there or like what type of product they're trying to shape. If they would even express it that way, which I doubt they would, frankly.
So when you started to see some of the press before you released the official identity, what was the reaction like internally? And given that some sort of design press has been effective at retracting rebrands, was there any of that sort of internal pressure at the Met?
No, it was very quiet, actually. I think people felt sad for me. No, I think that actually there was, it was a very robust process, and I think that many people understood why it was important for the museum, and that it wasn't about a mark, but about this larger aspiration to really reorganize the agenda of the museum in terms of connecting with the public. And so there was a sense of, I don't know, just kind of sort of interest in the phenomena of the whole furor that sort of rose up. But then I think a sense of also just kind of keep on keeping on, like we know this is right for this place right now. And, you know, it's all in the future and the execution and the way it evolves. And we're all working toward that. So there was never any sense that we would retract or, I mean, it just, that wouldn't make any kind of sense at all. Like, what would you retract to? We were about to open another new museum in 5 days. I mean, and it just didn't make any sense. I mean, it was, and actually the director at one point said, you know, he said, I'd love it if we could get the thoughtfulness of this process out into the world. And is there a way that we could do that? And, you know, it is difficult when a story gets out in that manner to sort of recalibrate the discussion. And the New York Times sort of set about to do that to some degree. Wired and Fast Company did articles also about it. But I think the biggest thing that was most influential about sort of resetting the table on the story was the opening of Breuer, because I think the design agenda of that building, outside of but related to the program, was so specific and clear, and wasn't at all sort of haphazard or arrogant. It was, you know, kind of very efficient and measured and kind of humble, and that was really, I think, respected by the New York community, the design community, and by the kind of larger cultural community. And so I think that really tempered the response. And that's good. I think that that's appropriate. So, yeah. That's, of course, my perspective.
Hi, thank you. I have a question. It's not about the Met logo. It's about the multi-festo work that you showed. Was that selective or curated in any way as to what 3 words you would put up for public display as
No, I mean, obviously there were some barriers, like there were certain filters so you couldn't say certain things, like bad words. But but no, it was completely crowdsourced, and there were some things that didn't make sense, and there were some things that weren't interesting, and from again my perspective. But I mean, it was collective, and there was no curation, or I mean, it was genuinely a kind of completely technology generated function outside of the form itself and the way that it was shot out into different venues. Okay, thank you, everyone.